When you hear the word constitution, what comes to mind? Probably a super dry, dusty old rulebook, right? Well, the Constitution of India is something else entirely. Think of it less as a rulebook and more as this incredible, ambitious blueprint. It was a plan to build the world's biggest democracy literally from scratch, and against some seriously insane odds. So the big question is, how on earth did they pull it off? Let's dive in. All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with a massive challenge India's founders were up against. Then we'll get into the 4 philosophical pillars that are the heart of it all. After that, we'll see how those big ideas were actually turned into real laws. We'll also talk about why this constitution is often called a living document that can breathe and change. And we'll wrap up by looking at what its promise means for India today.
Okay, so to really get what makes this document so special, you have to picture the scene in 1947. India wasn't just starting fresh. It was a society staggering out from under centuries of colonial rule. It was literally being torn in two by a brutal partition, and it was weighed down by social inequalities that were baked into the culture for generations. I mean, the task ahead of them was just monumental. And right in the middle of this massive undertaking was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. As the head of the drafting committee, he was more than just a legal scholar. He was this passionate champion for social justice. He knew, maybe better than anyone, that this new constitution couldn't just be about setting up a government. No, it had to do something much bigger. It had to try and heal a deeply wounded society and, crucially, lift up the people who had been pushed down for so long. Can you even imagine the weight of that responsibility?
And look, these weren't just abstract problems on a whiteboard. This was the real deal. The framers were staring down the painful legacy of colonialism, a caste system that was designed to deny people their basic dignity, poverty that was just crushing, and of course the raw open wounds from the partition. Honestly, any single one of those challenges could have completely shattered a new nation before it even got started.
So where do you even start with all that? How do you tackle problems that huge? Well, the answer is right there at the very beginning of the Constitution, in its preamble. You can think of the preamble as its soul, or maybe its North Star. It's the mission statement that lays out the 4 core values, the 4 pillars that would guide this brand new nation.
Yeah, this preamble is way more than just some fancy intro paragraph. It's a promise, a really powerful promise made to every single citizen. It kicks off with those famous words, "We the people," making it clear where the real power comes from. And then it lays out the fundamental values the country would aim for. So let's break down what those values actually are.
First up, pillar number 1, justice. And this is so important. They weren't just talking about judges in courtrooms. They were talking about social justice, actively fighting against inequality. And they were talking about economic justice, making sure everyone had a fair shot at the country's resources. It was a direct answer to all those deep-seated problems we just talked about. Okay, next we have liberty. And just like with justice, this meant more than just freedom from the British. It was about the freedom to do things, the freedom to think what you want, say what you believe, and become the best version of yourself without being held back by old ideas or a repressive government.
Then there's equality. Now, in a society that for centuries was built on a strict, rigid hierarchy, this was a bombshell. It was probably the most revolutionary idea in the whole document. It basically said, hey, it doesn't matter who your parents are, what caste you were born into, what god you pray to, or your gender. None of that determines your value anymore. Before the law, everyone is equal, period.
And the 4th and final pillar is fraternity. This is the glue. It's the thing that's supposed to hold everything else together. I mean, think about it. How would you get hundreds of millions of people, speaking different languages, practicing different religions, coming from totally different cultures, to feel like they're part of one single nation? You do it by building a sense of brotherhood. This idea that no matter how different we are, we're all Indians together. So there you have it. Justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. These are amazing, inspiring ideals, right? But here's the thing. Ideals on paper don't feed people or stop discrimination. The real magic, the genius of this Constitution was how it took that beautiful philosophy and forged it into actual, hard-hitting, enforceable laws. Let's look at how they made that happen. So this was the million-dollar question for the framers. How do you take a huge, beautiful concept like equality and make it mean something real to a person in a remote village who's facing discrimination every single day of their life? More importantly, how do you give that person the power to stand up and demand that right? And here's how they did it.
The Constitution didn't just make a vague statement like everyone should be equal. No, it got specific. It called out a very real problem, the horrible practice of untouchability. And then it delivered a direct legal knockout punch. Article 15 straight up forbids discrimination. And the practice of untouchability? Not just discouraged, it was abolished and made a punishable crime. That's how you turn philosophy into law.
And they use this same sharp, direct approach for a whole range of issues, creating what we now call the fundamental rights. These rights are the absolute foundation of Indian democracy. You've got the right to equality and freedom, which we've touched on, but there are also powerful rights against exploitation, like forced labor, and guarantees for religious freedom and the protection of different cultures. These aren't just suggestions. They are legal tools put directly into the hands of every citizen to hold the government accountable.
But the people who wrote this document were also incredibly smart. They knew they weren't fortune tellers. They couldn't possibly predict all the changes and challenges that would come up decades or centuries later. So they did something brilliant. They built a constitution that wasn't rigid and frozen in time. They made a living document, one that could breathe, adapt, and evolve with the nation. And you can really see this living quality in action when you look at how the courts have interpreted it over the years. A huge turning point came in 1973, with a famous case called Kesavananda Bharati. The case boiled down to one massive question. Can the parliament change anything it wants in the Constitution? Is its power unlimited? The Supreme Court's answer changed everything and gave birth to a brand new, powerful idea.
What emerged from that case is something called the Basic Structure Doctrine. Okay, what does that mean? Well, think of the Constitution like a house. The doctrine says Parliament can renovate the rooms, change the paint, add a window, but it cannot knock down the foundation walls. It can't destroy the basic structure. So core ideas like democracy, the rule of law, and secularism are off limits. It's this incredible balancing act between allowing for change while protecting the very soul of the nation.
Which, of course, brings us to today. Because, let's be real, for all its genius, the Constitution isn't a magic spell. It can't just wave a wand and fix everything. It's a promise. It's a blueprint. And the actual construction work, the job of making that blueprint a reality, well, that's a journey that never really ends. It's a task for every single generation.
Take that promise of economic justice, for instance. That's still a massive challenge, not just in India, but all over the world. I mean, look at these numbers. They show just how much of a country's income is held by the richest 20% versus the poorest 20%. In countries like South Africa or the US, the gap is just enormous. This really drives home the point that the constitutional goal of economic fairness isn't something India is struggling with alone. It's a work in progress for pretty much everyone.
You know, as we think about these huge, ongoing challenges, a quote from the poet Rabindranath Tagore comes to mind. He basically said that our ultimate loyalty shouldn't just be to our country, but to all of humanity. And that really fits here. The big ideas in India's constitution, justice, equality, brotherhood, they aren't just for Indians. They're what people everywhere are striving for. It connects India's journey to this bigger global quest.
So, if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's this. The Indian Constitution is without a doubt a remarkable achievement. It gives the country a map, a moral compass, and all the legal tools needed to create a fair society. But what good is a map if it just sits in a drawer? Its real power isn't in the paper it's written on. It's in the hands of the citizens and the institutions who are supposed to bring it to life every single day.
And that leaves us with one final thought, one big question. The founders drew up this incredible blueprint for a nation built on justice and liberty. But a blueprint is just a plan. The real question is, who's supposed to do the building? And the answer, of course, is right back where we started, in the preamble. The builders are we, the people. It's a responsibility that falls on every citizen to keep on building, brick by brick, day after day.